All right, very good. Why don't we go ahead and get started? My name is Philip Assis. I'm the Deputy Cultural Attaché in the Public Affairs section here at the U.S. Embassy in Islamabad. We are very pleased to have with us Dr. Iqbal Akhtar today. Dr. Akhtar is a Fulbright scholar. He's the only American Fulbright scholar at present in Pakistan. He is an associate professor at Florida International University and is the Fulbright Scholar in Residence at the University of Management and Technology in Lahore. We're also very pleased that you could all join us today. Truly appreciate you participating as an audience, and we look forward to your great questions. Um, just very quickly before turning the floor over, uh, Dr. Akhtar is. This work is the culmination of a Fulbright Fellowship trying to better understand how diversity and multiculturalism can be supported in the development of a new Pakistan. So we look very much forward to Dr. Akhtar's presentation. I would add that his comments are his own. He's not here as an official representative of the U.S. government. So his comments are his own. I would also note that this presentation is being recorded. You are free to, during the comment and question time, you are free to unmute yourself or put a question in the chat for Dr. Akhtar. And once again, we truly appreciate his time with us today and your time for joining us. Thank you, and I'll turn the floor over to Dr. Akhtar. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. I appreciate you giving me the time to talk and kind of do this Fulbright Reflections lecture. So this is the culmination of almost 5 months of work, and I'm very, very grateful, I think, to many people. Of course, Philip and Farah at the U.S. Embassy, Mr. Howell, Ms. Nabila, Ms. Tariq, Mr. Ghazanfar. The USEFP helped help me basically to execute this, and IIE, the Institute for International Education. So Salim Razak, Rita Akhtar, Zulfikar Bhutto, Ehsan, Ms. Doble as well. The UMT, Shway Pervez, Fatima Sajjad, Office of Internationalization. At Punjab University, Professor Gilani and Professor Khalid, and Bhawalpur, Professor Gilani. So there have just been a lot of people that have helped me over the course of the last 5 months. So I really appreciate your help, your guidance, and your time in guiding me through this process, which has been exceptional. And I think it's life-changing. So I really appreciate that. So to begin, I wanted to begin in the traditional greeting of Pakistan, which is Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. And to Pakistanis not of the Muslim faith, I wanted to say welcome, namaste, sat sri akal, jai jinendra. Thank you for joining. Today, the work that I'm doing is going to be just walking through the research that I've done over the last couple of months, and hopefully work that we would be able to continue here in Pakistan. So let's start with the idea of Pakistan. Anyone who is Pakistani or knows a little bit about Pakistan knows that the two leading figures in the creation of Pakistan was Allama Iqbal, who had the idea of Pakistan, and Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who created the country politically. But there's a lot, I think, behind that in terms of figuring out and understanding the diversity and the breadth of each of their viewpoints. Allama Iqbal is one of the great scholars of modern Persian. He's celebrated in Iran as one of the greatest sort of thinkers of modern Islam. Muhammad Ali Jinnah was not just both of them were not just trained as lawyers, but they also have tremendous political, religious, and philosophical writings, and especially Allama Iqbal's poetry in Urdu and as well as Persian is remarkable. And one of Allama Iqbal's greatest works is a reconstruction of Islamic thought that tries to fundamentally shift the way that we think about the tradition. So I think that is what I'm sort of working on and sort of thinking about is like, what exactly did Allama Iqbal and Quaid-e-Azam really think about with regards to the idea of Pakistan. And so I think we essentially have two major frames for thinking about the idea of Pakistan. The first is Pakistan as a nation for Muslims, so a haven for Muslims in the subcontinent, a place where political rights could be preserved. And the second place would be to think about Pakistan as an Islamic state. So it's a state that is governed by Islamic rules. And then that becomes sort of, the religion actually becomes associated with the state itself. And I think those are two fundamentally different ways about thinking about this idea of Pakistan. There's a professor at Beacon House National University, Tahir Kamran, who has kind of went through and thought about what are the main pillars of modern Pakistani identity that's evolved over the last 75 years. And this year we'll celebrate the 75th year of the creation of Pakistan. First is Islam as an ideology. So Islam becomes then the national ideology of the state. And it's the way by which the state understands itself and also projects itself. So symbols of religion, discourse of religion then becomes enmeshed with the idea of the state as well. The second is India as an existential other. So the idea either as India as an enemy or India as an other in terms of how to construct the identity of Pakistan. We do this as opposed to them doing that, right? And the third, of course, is Urdu as the national language, and that being sort of the main language of the state, Urdu as well as English. And then, of course, you have minority languages or regional languages as well. One of the things that we see with regards to Pakistan is that as much as Islam is fundamentally part of how we think about Pakistan today, it has a remarkable pre-Islamic past. So if we just think about the Buddhist heritage in Taxila, for instance, the Dharma Rajika Stupa at Taxila is one of the great sites for Buddhist history in the subcontinent. We think about the Hindu past, we think about the Jain communities, and the Sikh community as well. I mean, some of the greatest sites of Sikhism, including the place where Guru Nanak was born, is here in Pakistan. So the question then becomes, when we think about the story of Pakistan, how Pakistan is understood in Pakistan studies textbooks, what are the stories that are missing? How do you incorporate and tell the story of a country in 5,000 years, right? How do you make that in some way one story, or how do you present multiple stories for that? And I think that's kind of the work that the government is trying to do, the federal government at this point. We see with the single national curriculum, the incorporation of non-Muslim minorities in their religious traditions being preserved. But the question is, what does that mean though for Pakistan, right? So if religion has to be central to the idea of Pakistan, how do you construct a multi-religious society, right? So if we say the pre-Islamic past, then the reality of the situation is we're dealing with the Muslim present. And the Muslim present really begins with Muhammad bin Qasim in 711. The Ghazis, such as Muhammad of Ghazna, the creation of sort of the medieval Islamic empires, the Delhi Sultanate, the Mughal Empire, and then of course the creation of Pakistan, right? So the question is like, are we able to, as a, sort of here within Pakistan, to be able to go beyond the pre-Islamic past and the Muslim present as fundamentally opposed to each other? Or can they be reconciled as one continuous narrative of history, right? And so that, I think, is part of the challenge generally within Pakistani society. How do you accommodate the pre-Islamic past with the Muslim present? And that's the challenge in terms of, because that fundamental idea hasn't necessarily been reconciled, or it's reconciled in parts, it affects the way that the state's narrative with regards to non-Muslims, and in the spaces where non-Muslims can create sort of vibrant culture within Pakistan. So just to give you this image, which I thought is a very interesting image. So this is a poster. Just to go back. Okay, so this is a mural or sort of in UMT in Lahore. This is Greco Indian art or Bactrian art from the Gandhara period. This is the Badshah Masjid, the great sort of monument in Lahore. And this is a poster with regards to the situation of the Palestinians and Israelis. And of course, you have Quaid-e-Azam's picture there as well. So the question is then, we see many times that the main figures of Pakistan's history, Quaid-e-Azam, Allama Iqbal, are invoked for everything. So every group claims that they have them on their side, with very few people having actually read the diversity of the literature of Quaid-e-Azam and Muhammad and Allama Iqbal. So the question is that, how do we incorporate these two sort of somewhat opposing ideas of Islam and other religious traditions? My father grew up in Rawalpindi. He's originally from Chakwal. I grew up in the United States. I was born in New Orleans. And so it was very interesting to hear my father and people from his generation, when they grew up in Pakistan, in Rawalpindi in the 60s. Pakistan was a very multicultural society. It was a society that had Hindus, that had Christians in the major urban centers. They were going to school. It's really that many things changed in the 1980s and in the 1990s. And I think that's also important. So if we're trying to understand the narrative of the state today and sort of what it means to be Pakistani, we also have to understand the history of how Pakistan went from a more tolerant and multicultural society to one that has really narrowed in scope to a very narrow ideological understanding of Islam, because it's not just Islam focused, that even the diversity within Islam, so if we think about the Shia community and other groups, that has also been crowded out in terms of the diversity, the interfaith diversity of Pakistan as a whole. So how did this process take place in the 80s, especially in the 90s, and then the violence that really took place in the 2000s here in Pakistan? The last time that I was here in Pakistan, it was 20 years ago, and that was the time when you had the invasion of Afghanistan, and really the challenge and the changes of Pakistan in terms of the narrowing of Pakistan's identity has really taken place because of the wars in Afghanistan. So I think one of the things that we have to understand is sort of really acknowledging the past. This is a picture at the Wagah border between India and Pakistan outside of Lahore. There are two major traumas, I think, that inform the way that Pakistani society and the state think about Pakistan. The first is the trauma of partition, where hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people were displaced, hundreds of thousands of people died in very horrific violence in many different sort of ways, from killing to rape and torture, dispossession, this tremendous trauma that created India and Pakistan. And then the second was the trauma of 1971 and the creation of Bangladesh, or the loss from the West Pakistani perspective of East Pakistan as well. And I think those are two very important national traumas that inform the way that Pakistan understands itself. So part of it is to understand India as an existential other, right? So India as the supporting factor in the dissolution of the United State of Pakistan, and also the violence of partition itself, and then the border skirmishes and wars that India and Pakistan have fought over the years as well. So I think that's part of it, is that there's this idea that there has to be national unity against sort of an existential other, an existential threat to the very survival of Pakistan. So I think as we embark on the next 75 years of Pakistani history, the question then becomes, is Pakistan still at a state of existential threat to its own existence? Or is Pakistan now established as a state And that security paradigm with the nuclear options that both societies have, has it created a new space for peace and stability between both countries, right? And we see this in the recent communiques by the government of Imran Khan, in terms of changing the strategic posture of Pakistan, that it's no longer simply seeing India as the competitive other and as an existential threat, but there can be new avenues for peace and cooperation, and particularly economic cooperation between both societies, because that's really essential to the stabilization of both societies. So I think there are two ways that we have to think about it. Within Pakistani society, you have to really deal with introspection and the reality of the violence that was committed within Pakistan and by Pakistanis, right? So every challenge is, or every threat that exists in Pakistan, every terrorist incident is not a foreign plot against Pakistan, but there are serious problems with regards to policies and history within Pakistan to be acknowledged. But then the conspiratorial thinking that exists within Pakistan doesn't come out of thin air either. It's also born of history, right? So part of acknowledging the past that Pakistanis and the Pakistani state especially has to do in terms of understanding its misdirections in the history of Pakistan is also, unfortunately, American involvement in Afghanistan and the way that then helped to, in a way, change the discourses within Pakistan itself. So both societies have had a hand in the situation that we have today, right? So both the United States and Pakistani societies, in their involvement, in their working together to defeat communism or sort of other threats, have also then created other issues as well. So the question is, how can both societies work together going forward in a new sort of era of largely peace and stability in Pakistan compared to sort of previous decades? How can we, as both societies, move forward in terms of moving the dialogue of what it means to be Pakistani to incorporate new perspectives? And here, I think the universities are a very critical piece to the entire story. So what's happened in the last 20 years, last 10 years, is an explosion of universities across Pakistan. So there are more than 220 universities across Pakistan. Of course, most of those are concentrated in the urban centers. And in Lahore, as in Islamabad and many other cities, there have been private universities that have opened up, right? So UMT itself has, I think about 25,000 students. University of Lahore, University of the Punjab, private public universities. I mean, if you add up all of the numbers of these students across all of the urban centers, across universities, across Pakistan, you're getting into millions of students, right? And so, can the university then, a place where people from different parts of Pakistan are able to come together, where they spend time together, where they meet each other, where international students also come from Afghanistan, from Africa, from other places? Can the university and the professors there help to develop new ways of thinking about Pakistan and also new research to help support that? So when we think about American history, the idea of America as a multicultural society, as a melting pot, as a salad bowl, whatever you want to call America now today, that paradigm of America is not the paradigm that existed in the 1950s in the United States, which was the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, the WASP sort of idea of what it meant to be an American. And in 1965, there was a change to immigration laws that increased the number of people from Africa and Asia that were able to come to the United States, particularly highly qualified and highly skilled people, like my parents. But also you had social upheavals that were taking place within the United States as well. So you had the civil rights movement, the push for Black rights, you had the women's rights movement, you had workers' rights movement. So you had many different movements that were sort of Native American rights movement. And so these protest movements at the level of people, we think of Rosa Parks, Malcolm X, Muhammad Ali, was also being intellectually supported by the universities. So university scholars, professors, students, they were writing new stories of what it meant to be an American. So they were now recording Black histories of what it meant to be an American, Native American histories of what it meant to be an American. And those narratives that were happening at the university level were being taught to students. Papers were being published, public seminars were being given, and then those ideas then entered public discourse and then became part of what it means to be American now today. So now it's not really the government necessarily that has to push multiculturalism. You have institutions across society that push for multiculturalism, whether it is corporations like Nike, or it could be schools and universities, it could be local institutions, state, or federal, right? So across the different institutions that exist in society, there is an understanding and a consensus that America is a multicultural society. Of course, America is going through its own challenges right now in terms of redefining its identity, but there is no turning back from the idea of a multicultural society, a society that's somehow inclusive. And so the question then becomes, here in Pakistan, is what is the role in the space of universities, of students, in the creation of the idea of a new Pakistan, right? One of the things that we're seeing is that the core of this, of course, and I think this is kind of the underlying, is that Pakistan historically has been a very important player economically, the region that we now call Pakistan, in ancient history. Think about the Silk Road, we're thinking about sort of the crossroads where what's Pakistan and kind of now Afghanistan as well, played in the negotiation between the people of the steppes and the people of the Gangetic Plateau, right? Coming through Pakistan, ideas, cultures, religions, civilizations that have grown up within Pakistan itself. Right now, then there's new economic corridor, the CPEC corridor that's going to be developed, right? New sort of economic ideas in terms of how to expand and open up Pakistan to foreign investment. If those things happen, then Pakistan again is going to be open up to new different types of people, to people from China, people from Central Asia, people from the West that are going to be coming in and want to sort of invest or engage with Pakistani history and culture. The question is, how do you respond to that? But also the multicultural challenges, right? So I think, and that's kind of the larger issue, is that the issue, the ethnic, the cultural, the religious tensions that exist within Pakistan today are based on legitimate challenges. They're legitimate challenges of economic development. They're issues of political power, right? Of social mobility, of social space that's given to different groups. And the question is, how do you negotiate these sorts of spaces to create a pluralistic or multicultural society? Can each community be given an intellectual, cultural space to be able to do the work of creating, of being generative, of being able to create and develop new ideas? When we think of the United States, we think of immigrants particularly as having a very, very important space and place in the creation of the modern United States. So when you think about like the great companies in Silicon Valley, for instance, the majority of them are run by Indians, particularly mostly of South Indian origin, right? We think about some of the great Nobel laureates who are Jewish Americans, right? So if minority communities and groups are given the space, the resources, access, that diversity helps to create new ideas. And those new ideas then can be used to economically and politically develop society. So I think that's the larger challenge, is that the question then becomes like, how do we understand and integrate all of those people, spaces, and ideas to create economic development within Pakistan, and also political maturity as well. So I think going forward, I think this is the larger question. I mean, I've been here, again, thanking the USCFP, IIE, the State Department, the embassy, for 5 months. And I've really, I've been the first US scholar to come to Pakistan in about 6 or 7 years. So it's quite an honor to be here and to be able to represent the United States in the work that I'm doing. The idea is like, how do we take this work forward? And so I think this is kind of some work that I hope to continue to do in the next 2 years. But it's really to continue the conversation across Pakistan. So I was based in Lahore, and we've developed a great network between our university, UMT, University of the Punjab, Bhawalpur University, University of Peshawar, University of Lahore, some of these wonderful institutions that exist, Beacon House National University. How do we take that conversation forward to other parts of Pakistan, to Islamabad, to Peshawar, to Karachi, to Quetta, and see what are those perspectives? How does local, ethnic, cultural, religious sort of perspectives differ in these different places? And what are their stories of what it means to be Pakistani? So the idea of being a Sindhi and Sindhi history and culture connected to shrines and the saints is very different from Punjabi ideas versus very different from the people of Gilgit-Baltistan. So each of these communities have unique histories. What are those histories? What are those voices? And what are those experiences? Because I think that's something that is very important for us. How do we listen to other stories within Pakistan with a sense of humility? That we do not dismiss the challenges or the perspectives of others, but in a very open way, we actively listen to different perspectives and people that have had challenges in what it means to be Pakistan, and also being open to that ethnic and linguistic and religious diversity. And so the idea would be then to maybe over the next 2 years to work with graduate students to do research and better understand what are the different narratives that exist here within Pakistan among different groups. What are the perspectives with regards to gender, the gender divide within Pakistan, the ethnic and the linguistic differences in terms of perspectives of what it means to be Pakistani. What do the religious minorities have to say within what it means to be Pakistani? And I think another very important one among, we would say, with the majority of Muslims is interfaith. So what are the different Muslim communities and groups, the Deobandis, the Brahmavis, the Shia, different groups that exist within Pakistan, within the Muslim community, because they're not monolithic either. But also thinking about Pakistan with regards to class and caste distinctions. So we think of Pakistan as, okay, well, it's a Muslim majority society, but it's actually not united in the way that you would think. Just because people are Muslim doesn't necessarily mean that they all think the same way or act the same way. So what are the perspectives from people of different classes within Pakistan? How does caste identity intersect with religious identity, which intersects with national identity? And how do we also then rethink about the past? Is every Muslim in the past a hero and every non-Muslim a villain? How do we think about the Buddhist and the Jain, those heritages that have thousands of years of history? How do they contribute to what it means to be Pakistani? And so that's kind of the larger project that I hope to continue, with the support of the institutions here, to take that and figure out what are the different stories that exist, and can those stories be woven together into a carpet of what it means to be Pakistani, that it doesn't necessarily need to be one simple idea, but it can be a complex idea. And it's an idea of Pakistan that comes from a place of confidence. It's not a society that is on the threat of being destroyed. It's a society that it's connected to thousands of years of history, and the grounding in history and the indigenous cultures, languages, and civilizations that have come and that constitute what it means to be Pakistani can be a source of strength for Pakistan. It's a way of thinking about what it means to be Pakistani that cannot be destroyed, that cannot be erased. It's not something that just begins in the 6th century or the 11th century or the 14th century, whatever the century that you're interested in, but it's something that's intimately connected with the land and to the genetic, heritage, and to the artistic and the linguistic and the music and the intellectual traditions that make the mosaic of what it means to be Pakistani. If we think of someone like Allama Iqbal, his ideas, his philosophies are embedded within the language, within the cultures, within the civilizations. He was was an inheritor of 1,000 years of literary tradition, of heritage, of language and high culture. And that's something that doesn't go away. And that's something that can be cultivated as well. So as you have people now from villages who are coming to the main cities, you have a chance, as you have thousands of new students every year entering the universities of Pakistan, you have an opportunity with the urbanization of Pakistan to open up the idea of Pakistan, to create a multicultural idea of Pakistan, and to make Pakistan not one solitary idea, but the idea of Pakistan as a conversation. It's the beginning of multiple conversations across society that is inclusive of different viewpoints. So you can disagree with the state, but still be Pakistan. You can disagree with the national ideology as formatted and present your own idea of what it means to be Pakistani. And those are equally valid, that you can be loyal in your difference. That having a different viewpoint doesn't mean that you're disloyal to the state. It doesn't mean that you're disloyal as Pakistani, but that means that you can have a diversity of opinion, and that diversity helps to strengthen the society and allows you to create new ideas, and that difference can be economically, politically, and socially productive. So with that, I wanted just to conclude the short speech, and I really appreciate again the funding, the time, the space to be able to do this work. And then we hope to continue it over the next 2 years with more sort of creating the network and ideally momentum among universities to do research, to understand, and to listen actively to the diversity of views and perspectives of what it means to be Pakistani. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Akhtar. That is very, very interesting, and you raise a lot of great questions. At this point, if you're open and we still have time, I believe we could entertain some questions. Please feel free to either unmute yourself or put them in the chat. I've got a couple comments already in the chat box. Looks like they are comments and not questions. I guess I'll start with one question I had.
Please.
You didn't mention the role of social media and travel, especially social media, and that's something, a trend that we see globally, certainly in the United States, of both forging people together, making the world much smaller, but at the same time creating reactions against multiculturalism or against a sense of loss of identity. Do you see, or what do you have any thoughts about the role of positively or negatively towards the new identity of Pakistan coming from social media?
Yeah, thank you so much, Philip. Yeah, I mean, I think that that's really a challenge, I think, for the larger issue that, I didn't really touch that much upon, but is really a challenge with regards to having these sort of discussions, is the larger issue, which is this issue of blasphemy within Pakistan, right? So if, we saw really unfortunately a couple of weeks ago, almost now 2 months, the Sri Lankan gentleman who died in Sialkot. And so he was just kind of accused of blasphemy, and then people kind of gathered in crowds and they killed him, unfortunately. And that was all done by social media. I mean, social media really just sort of exacerbated and really amplified people's emotions. So I think that's a huge problem. I think really figuring out kind of what is a larger strategy with regards to thinking about, disinformation, or, I mean, it really is disinformation. I mean, clearly, like, whatever the allegations against him were completely false or fabricated. And it was just kind of a vendetta, right? So that's something else that we see, is that religion is used as a way to justify any sort of violence, or any sort of like a problem that you have, with someone else. I think that one would be to think about within existing organizations, social, sort of social advocacy groups and things like that, what are their social media strategies, right? So that should be something that can be funded more actively to create sort of new spaces that are, I think the larger issue, I think there's an institute in the United States called the Aspen Institute, and they do a lot of work on thinking about pluralism in the United States and kind of the challenges. There's a huge divide between, I guess you could say, the red state and the blue states, the Republicans and Democrats. And essentially what's happened now with social media is that people live in their own information universes and they never talk to each other, essentially, or they only hear with their own news, right? So figuring out what are strategies to be able to, at in individual level or also in information media, social media sort of level, create conversations across media universes. So across these like these sorts of worlds of information, how do you develop new conversations between these different groups of people? Because I think one of the things that we see is that, okay, one of the social media platforms has said something or done something that people in Pakistan are upset with, we just ban it, right? So you just ban YouTube for a bit, or you ban Twitter for a bit. I don't think that that's really the answer to the situation. I think you have to figure out how to create more sophisticated media campaigns and social media campaigns by existing organizations that are trying to promote this sort of work. And then the second would be to improve in-person interactions, right? So if every student in Pakistan, in Lahore, for instance, as a child, goes to the Guru Arjan Gurdwara near Badshai Masjid, and they go to see the Gurdwara and they take a meal at the langar there, that can have a huge impact on them, even later in life when they hear something negative about Sikhs or other people, right? So I think that also prioritizing face-to-face interactions. A lot of students I see, a lot of times they go to the Lahore Museum, and I've seen, tons of school kids that go there, and that's really a wonderful experience. But you're learning about history as children in the abstract. So these are archaeological sites. And again, the perspective is, well, this is an ancient civilization that's died away. That's the perspective, right? What if you can meet people that are practitioners in real time at these really impressionable points in your life, right? We know that, I'm an advocate of early childhood education. So years 1 to 6 is a really important years for the development of a child's sort of brain and cognition and sort of expansion and understanding of the world. That's an important time to explore. When they're young children or even in high school, being able to go and experience that diversity that exists in Pakistan. Sindh has a great number of Hindu, comparatively speaking, I should say, sort of non-Muslim communities, Hindu, a few Buddhist, and a few Jain communities that exist there. Lahore, Islamabad, here you have in Islamabad and Rawalpindi, you have all of the consulates and embassies that are here from different parts of the world. So I think prioritizing, what we would consider in the Fulbright jargon, citizen-to-citizen diplomacy. Like, how do you promote that? And I think the work that you guys do at State Department is essential. Funding the Fulbright program is a very important part of that. So I think, trying to, to do those two, I think those are the two ideas, really, is to create more sophisticated social media campaigns. And the second is just to get people to know and to meet each other at a young age in mass numbers of people. I think that could have a huge impact. Many Pakistanis have never really, met people of another faith or from another country. So I think that's that has an impact. Yeah. Thanks.
Great, thank you. We have a few more questions and also some comments in the chat box that I would direct to all. They're directed to everyone. The first question is from Misam Alam, who asks how you see multilingualism in relation to national identity.
Yeah, that's a very good question, Professor Alam. Thank you for asking that question. So I think that's a very important point. I mean, one of the challenges, so we see that Pakistan, this is the pioneering work of Tariq Rahman, again at Beacon House National University. His work focuses on thinking about language with regards to class stratification. So elites within Pakistan know and can speak English. Then the second tier of sort of hierarchy is the Urdu language, and that's very important for government bureaucratic sort of work. And then the lower tier would be the regional languages or local languages, right? And that's a hierarchy, and that's important because that hierarchy then determines also many times, not always, but many times your capacity for economic and social mobility in society. So that's a challenge because there are two things, the challenges that I see. One is that and again, I'm working with universities. So one of the challenges also is that what we've learned from language learning over the last couple of decades is that if you are able to learn to think deeply in one language, you can translate that into other languages. So if you can learn and think deeply in Chinese, you can eventually learn how to translate that into English. But if your education is fragmented across languages, where you are from the northern areas and you're forced to learn in Urdu, but then you also are forced to learn in English to an extent, and you're getting essentially half education. You're being forced to memorize some stuff in English. You have somewhat of a working knowledge of Urdu, but then your home language is a completely different language. That really affects your capacity to be able to express and understand your ideas in a very clear manner. And we see that, I think, even here, I'm at the headquarters of the U.S. Education Foundation for Pakistan, graciously, allowed me to use their office. They get applications from all over Pakistan. And I think this is one of the challenges. And when I work with PhD students and things like that, a lot of times sometimes it's just the ability to communicate in English, which I think is solvable. But if you can't think deeply in any of the languages and your capacity to think is fragmented across languages, then it doesn't matter how good you are in a language, that something becomes interrupted when you're not able to master one language well. So I think that that's another question, is that like Urdu is being pushed as the national language of Pakistan, but it's the native language of just a handful of people, a percentage of people within Pakistan. It's usually the second language of most people. So I think the question is like, how do you construct a multilingual society that allows you to be able to work in local languages and then also be able to, and what that means when I say work across languages is that there has to be economic rewards possible within local languages. So if you know the Kalash language well, can I find some sort of government job or funding to be able to preserve and to communicate in that language and do something well within that language, right? Because one of the things that we're seeing with some of the minority languages, and I know some you do work with communities like Kalash and other languages as well, Burshasky, there's so many really remarkable minority languages that are endangered in Pakistan, on the verge of dying out, is there ends up being a lot of shame associated with local identities, with languages that are not Urdu. And those languages then really become endangered, and so much is lost of history, culture, and civilization through the loss of those languages. So that's another thing that, to think about, is that, and not only that, but those languages can have economic dividends. And that's one of the things that it's really remarkable to see this government pushing for this idea of religious tourism. Have Buddhists come, from, the hundreds of millions of Buddhists that are in the world, come to Pakistan and tour sites, develop a tourism infrastructure. Hindus, Jains, Muslims of different communities, that come to Pakistan, Hindus, Jains, Sikhs, on great numbers. And then you create the economic possibilities whereby local languages then can have economic value. You can preserve local art forms, music, culture, and then local languages can have a use in the economic development of those regions. So that's why I feel that the preservation is both at the policy level, but also then it has to be in terms of economic development. Because I think one of the challenges within Pakistan is that I was doing work with a student that works on the Hazara, And the perspective of the Hazara community is, well, the government's not doing enough. It's true, they're not doing enough for what's happening to the Hazara community. But the question is that how much and to what extent is the government willing to do something about it? So can we empower the citizens of Pakistan to be able to vote en masse, for instance, or to be able to organize themselves politically, to be able to put pressure on the government as well, right? So it's not simply that the government solves all of the problems, is how do you organize yourself, create your own momentum to then force the issue that then changes government policy as well. So I think that's also part of it, is like, can these communities create enough momentum from the work that they're doing, connecting with international organizations, creating economic opportunities to be able to push for legitimate multilingualism in Pakistan?
Great, thank you. We have about 10 minutes left and 3 questions lined up if we have time for them.
Sure.
The next one is from my colleague Zakaria, who asks, how important, in your opinion, is it to separate state matters from religious matters?
I think that's a very, very important point, and I think one of the bigger challenges within Pakistan. I think that one of the things that we see from the example of Iran, for instance, is that when you go to Iran or you go to Saudi Arabia, for instance, for that matter, go to the main urban areas, go to Riyadh, go to Tehran, you see, which is just remarkable, is not just people who are non-religious among young people, but straight up atheism, like anti-religion. And part of why we see that in Saudi Arabia and Iran, and again, I use these 2 examples because they're kind of both the opposite ideological positions of Islam, Sunni and Shia, but also 2 that have really taken religion into the ideology of the state, is when you push state policy in the name of religion, what ends up happening is that both its failures and its successes are then put on religion. So if the state fails to do something, then it's not just a failure of the state, but it's the failure of Islam itself. Or if you disagree with what the state is doing, then no, you're not just disagreeing with the state policy, you're actually anti-Muslim, right? Anti-Islam. And so then it becomes very difficult then to disagree with the state, but it also then just pushes people against religion, right? So if we look at like the example of Iran is the example of Turkey, right? So we think about like Turkey, you had a hardcore secularist, really kind of anti-religion, I should say, a interpretation of secularism in Turkey by Ataturk and sort of succeeding generations. What happened when the Anatolian majority came into the cities and were able to exert political power? I mean, you have then the kind of the return of religion into the public sphere in a very different way. So societies essentially are this pendulum. They go back and forth. So if you push religion too hard, people will turn against it. If you push against religion, people will turn towards it, right? And the question is like, how do you kind of find the middle path, right? Islam is supposed to be the Sirat al-Mustaqim, right? Kind of in a way, the guided or the middle path. And so how do you both use the really remarkable concepts that exist within Islam, the idea of giving to the poor, the idea of taking care of others, all of these great ideas that exist within the tradition itself, you can incorporate that into state policy without using religion as the conduit to have social policies, right? And I think that that is a very fine line and a distinction, but it's an important one because ultimately you want there to be space within the society to have differences of opinion. Because when the state says, okay, this is what Islam is, there's no one monolithic Islam either. The Brailvis have a different perspective from the Deobandis, from the different Shia communities that exist with the Ithnashris or the Ismailis or other groups, Nurbakhshis, whatever the groups that are there. So there's really no one Islam either. And then you're privileging one over another, and that inevitably creates conflict. It inevitably creates problems. So that's why I think that there should be the ethics and the values of the tradition, but to separate it from the actual implementation of religion itself.
Great, thank you. Um, okay, Fatima Ghani asks, thank you for bringing up concerns of intersectionality and showcasing how nuanced diversity is as a concept. You have mentioned the role of the state, corporations, and other major actors in instigating change. However, I'd like to know your thoughts on the extent to which social change can be engineered by individuals, if at all.
That's a very good question, Fatima. Thank you for that. Okay, when you think about leaders in American history, for instance, a leader like Lincoln, for instance, was Lincoln a great leader because he was a remarkable person, or was he a decent leader in remarkable times? So the question is like, is it the character of the person, or is it at the right moment in history that you're able to do it? I feel it's a little bit of both. So I think that you can be a great leader, and if things are not changing, if you're not at a moment of one of the terminologies that is used now in America is inflection point, that societies move in like momentum, right? Think about a truck on the motorway. It just keeps going and going at a speed. It takes time for it to shift or move. But at the point where it stops, you can change direction. So the question then becomes, is Pakistan at that point where things are have been challenged enough that that there's a point of change that's possible, whether it's because of the federal government, whether it's because of what the pandemic has done to change society and the world as a whole. Is this a moment where that's possible? And the second thing I think is that I do feel that individuals have a space and a place. I think people like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King help to create momentum. So it's not necessarily an individual, but it's the individual and that idea that can then be used to create a movement of people. I do think it's possible. I don't think that change, we shouldn't be completely disillusioned or think that change is not possible. I do think it's possible. And I think that if you're able to create enough momentum with like-minded people, and I think also maybe be willing to bear some of the cost, right? So even the thinking about the civil rights movement in America, it wasn't a linear progression. It wasn't that the majority were like, yeah, you're right, we need to give Black people more rights in America. There was opposition, political, economic, social opposition to that, but that was eventually overcome, right? So I think Martin Luther King has a very good phrase, which I like a lot, is that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I think that's a really beautiful phrase, that it's a long struggle, it's hard, it could take a generation or two or three, but ultimately there's something just about creation and sort of the world, the existence of the world today. And especially if you think of those in spiritual terms, that even from an Islamic perspective, the idea of adl, God as just is one of the names of God as well in the Quran. That there's something right? There's something that was fundamentally right about the Black struggle for civil rights, that at its core, you knew that it was the right thing. People could, be opposed to it for many different reasons, but ultimately there's something innate within us that knows that this is right. And I think that voice can eventually win out with enough time and effort.
Thank you. I think we have time for just one more question, and then I know we'll need to wrap it up. And this one is from Mr. Atif Tufail, who asked to pose this question directly. You can please unmute yourself, Atif.
Thank you very much, Philip, for giving me the opportunity and amazing and enlightening lecture by Dr. Akhtar. So my question is that, Dr. Akhtar, you have talked about Muslim identity and then diversity. What I feel that even if we preserve our Muslim identity, even then we have to follow the instruction of Holy Quran, which says, La ikraha fid deen. There is no compulsion in faith or religion. And what I feel that we should promote those enlightened persons for becoming Fulbright scholars who can work within the framework of Islam and can present a more tolerant and diverse picture of Islam. Just like there is no compulsion in religion, then again there is a verse of Holy Quran that even if you injure one person, then you affect the whole humanity at a large. And here, human beings and their self-esteem, it is being upheld. Not any Muslim's self-esteem is being held. So what are your thoughts about it?
Thank you so much, Atif Saab. I think that one of the things that we're doing, and hopefully we continue to do this work in subsequent years, I think is precisely what you were saying, is to create a religious language around the idea of multiculturalism, tolerance, and pluralism, that there exists within the Islamic tradition all of what you're saying, Quranic ayahs, we have hadiths of the Holy Prophet, we have remarkable poetry from the great poets of Sindh, the Punjab, that talk about this. So it's embedded across different levels, right? Across sacred texts, across cultural traditions, all of these exist. And I think that that's going to be a very important part of the work that we do, is that we need to bring all of those ideas within the language that people can understand. So maybe they won't be able to understand what I'm saying in English, but they'll be able to understand verses of the Quran. They'll be able to understand those sorts of things. And if you can bring that as a coordinated effort, you can bring Punjabi Shair, all of those things can help to be able to create more space and more acceptance by people. So I think that's an excellent idea, and that's something that we hope to work with religious scholars as well in terms of this project. So thank you, Atif Saab.
And thank you, Dr. Akhtar, for your very informative and thought-provoking presentation today. We truly appreciate you joining us today, and we salute your work as our American Fulbright scholar here in Pakistan. Let's give a collective round of applause. I know we're virtual. I wish we could be in person. This was supposed to be held in the NPR, by the way, but obviously COVID had another thought on that. But I think it actually worked out that we were able to have colleagues from Lahore join us as well. So that's wonderful. So truly, thank you very much. And apologies also we had a few outstanding questions we did not have time to get to. My apologies for that. But thank you once again. All the best to all of you. Allah Hafiz.
All right, thank you so much, Philip. Take care. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you.
Khud Hafiz.
Thank you.